So welcome everybody to today's webinar from Enfield Voices. We're actually talking about a more sensitive subject today, about contemplating our mortality. So death is usually a subject most of us like to avoid or put to the back of our minds, but with this onset of the coronavirus crisis, many of us are being forced to think about it more acutely, as we either contemplate being unable to be near sick relatives, or we're seeing lots of stories of families on the news either unable to attend funerals or being unable to visit them in hospital towards the end. I've got with me today Rev Mark Meatcher, and he's going to be talking to me a bit about the topic today. And also because this is actually Dying Awareness Week from the 11th to the 19th of May, and talking a little bit more about that. So just to kick off, Mark, thanks for joining us. Can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experience?
Thank you, Katie, for that introduction. Yes, I'm, as you've said, I'm a church minister. I'm a United Reformed Church minister. I've been a minister for about the last 11 years. But during my ministry so far, part of that experience involved being a hospice chaplain for about 18 months in a hospice in Southend, where it was an adult hospice and a children hospice. So the chaplaincy team worked across two sites and dealt with not just adults that were generally close to end of life, but also children with life-limiting illnesses. So complete sort of two different hospices, but again dealing with people in difficult situations.
Yes.
And I've been in Enfield for the last almost 2 years now.
Okay. And so if we just kick off by talking about, why do you think it's so important to have conversations about death and dying? It's often a topic that people try and avoid as much as possible, or put to the back of their mind often, but why do you think it's important that we do have these sorts of open conversations?
Well, I think that's you've answered the question in many ways, in that it is something that we tend to shy away doing. We tend to avoid talking about death. We don't want to sort of go there. We think it's something that is difficult in all sorts of different circumstances, and in very many ways death over the last couple of years has become the subject that you don't talk about, much like sex used to be. We didn't used to talk about sex, but now we seem to be able to talk about that quite easily, relatively, but nowadays it tends to have been death, or certainly in the last few years it's been death that we don't talk about. And yet it is quite strange, because probably 100 years ago it was a little bit easier, because there was a bit more of a tradition that actually death was something that happened around you more, whereas over the sort of 20th century, we sort of moved death away from our local environment, and it tends to now happen in hospital or in hospice rather than in the home, whereas it was more something that happened in the home and was closer to us.
Yes, that's right. And what do you think has made a difference in that scenario? Do you think that people find it more difficult to have those conversations in an area that's not familiar to them? I guess a lot of people, and not just talking about death, I suppose a lot of people don't like hospitals and the environment of a hospital. Do you think that's something that also puts people off from being able to have easy conversations around the subject?
I think it's a mixture. I think that's interesting at the moment with what's going on with the coronavirus epidemic, is that in general, hospitals have been places where people go to sort of be treated for illness, and you don't expect people not to come out of hospital. The vast majority of people go into hospitals, they're treated, they have their operations or whatever, and they come out again. Whereas I think what we've seen, particularly in the last 8-9 weeks, is that hospitals have almost become the new hospice. Whereas if people mention, oh, somebody's going into a hospice, the perception has been you go into a hospice to die. That's not actually the case, and a vast majority of people that came into hospice might have been for respite care or something like that, and they've come out of hospice. Whereas now, people have gone into hospital, instead of getting better, the death rate in hospitals increased. Hopefully that's reducing at the moment, but I just think in part that we generally, and I always found this strange, that the only two things that are certain in life is death and taxes, as I think as Bertrand Russell said, and yet those two, you know, taxes we moan about all the time,
Yeah.
but death, we shy away for some reason from talking about it, and yet it's the one thing that all of us are certain about having to face or encounter in our lives. It's the only thing that is definitely going to happen, and I don't think any of us knows fully the answer as to what happens after death. We can speculate, we can dream, we can talk about some of the encounters that other people have had, perhaps, but it's, I don't know, we shy away from it.
Do you think that's maybe why people have more fear, because it is an unknown? I suppose there's a lot of things people can talk about their experience of. You know, people don't generally come back and talk about their experience of dying unless you've had a near-death experience and you may have clinically died, you know, and, you know, sometimes people tell stories that they've seen lights at the end of the tunnel, or, you know, sometimes people have felt nothing, but, you know, the truth is we don't absolutely know, and perhaps that's what adds to the fear and uncertainty. A lot of other life experiences, whether that's people going through an illness, there's usually some other group or support group where you can talk to other people who've maybe gone through it. This is something that actually we can really only guess about, I suppose.
And I think that's one of the things that was so important when I was working at the hospice, was the, if you like, the carers networks and the networks of friends and things like that, that there were people there who were going through the same experience as you were going through, or had been through that experience, and that the encouragement that you get from talking to people who have been there and done it before, or have been alongside people that have been dying, has been so supportive and so helpful for people that are now facing that situation. You know, that, as you say, that it's a bit like going through divorce in some ways. People that have already been through a divorce are probably the best people to actually help you through that. People that have gone through similar illnesses are the best people that can help you go through that. And it's the same in terms of encountering death and dying. It's people that have been on that journey, or supported somebody through that journey, who are the best ones to be able to support you through that.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe you can tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the positive stories around things that have happened in a hospice. Because again, actually, like you said, a lot of people's preconception is you're going to a hospice to die. That's not always the case anyway. But I also think there's a sort of preconception that actually it must be a miserable place, or it must be an unhappy place because, you know, people are dying. But I also understand that's not also, I don't have any personal experience, but, you know, my understanding of stories from others is that that's not necessarily the environment, or that's not the feeling that's actually there when you're actually there in person.
No, I completely opposite, in that they tend to be very, very positive places. And I think that's one thing that's, again, come out over the last few weeks from the coronavirus thing, is that a lot of people have talked about not being able to be present when their loved one has died. But I think that, you know, 99% of the time, someone will have been present with that person when they died. A nurse, a member of the nursing team, a member of the doctors, or something like that. Somebody will have been present when somebody will have died. And the experience of being in hospice is that it was very mixed in terms of, yes, there was an element of people being fearful, but there was also the element of support and encouragement being around you. And there was also some incredible stories about good things that were happening and support that was offered. I remember in particular one person who had never drunk real ale until they came into the hospice, and suddenly this was said, oh well, I'll try it now, and so she was given a bottle of, I can't remember what it was, one of the real ale beers, and she absolutely loved it. And so she ended up virtually having a pint of beer every day in her last days of her life, so much so that when she did eventually die, on her funeral service there was a picture of her surrounded by about a dozen bottles of beer on the front cover of a funeral service. But she sort of, you know, she was jolly and happy and everything else. Yes, she knew that she was dying and she was going to die shortly. But in those last few days, she was able, and her family were just so delighted that she was able to enjoy that experience of the last days of her life. And there's so many other people. And I think the other thing that I think I found quite interesting was that quite often people who were in that situation, and in fact, it comes in sometimes when I go and visit people when I'm in hospital or at home. Up until recently, I haven't been able to do too much of that lately, obviously. But is that quite often people would say, "Oh, I don't really want to see the chaplain," because there was an element of hang on, something there that I don't want to face. And in the hospice that I was working in, we did not wear our clerical collars. We were just like one of the staff team with our badges on. And quite often it was a case of you would not go and see anybody unless they specifically wanted you to see them or whatever. We tended to go and see people. But because we were around the hospice, we were able to talk to people in the garden area and by the coffee machine and other bits and pieces. And once people got to know us as people, they realized it was okay and we were all right to talk to. And in part, the role of the chaplaincy team was very much a question of just being another person, another human being alongside a human being who was going through a really, really difficult time. And a lot of the time it is a question of just, for any of us can do this, just being there to hold someone's hand. And I think the question of touch, which a lot of people at this precise moment in time missing more than anything else. I mean, you did a funeral the other day where we were stood around 6 foot apart or 2 meters apart from one another. And it was just that whole sense of, but I can't even shake your hand to say thank you for doing the funeral service. I can't embrace my relative who also feeling the same pain that I'm feeling because our auntie or our niece or whatever it was, or our sister has just died. And that element of touch can be so comforting and so supportive for people.
It's very difficult and really completely unprecedented, actually. I think it's kind of overwhelming for everybody, whatever the situation. But when you think about the simple things that sometimes bring comfort in those sorts of difficult times, a lot of those are actually just physically impossible because of the nature of what we're facing. I think actually one of the questions I was going to ask, just touching on what you said about being in the hospice and not necessarily wearing your collar while you was there as a chaplain, do you think there was a difference between people who had faith versus people perhaps who may not have faith when it comes to dealing with bereavement or talking about dying?
That's an interesting, and I think there's two sides to that. I think that in general, those people that have got some kind of faith or some kind of belief have a greater peace about them, that there is some sort of confidence about what's going to be happening and what they're facing up to next. And obviously, as a Christian minister, I would say that, wouldn't I? I would hope to say that. But at the same time, there were others who had probably been involved in some kind of religion for the whole of their lives, perhaps, who suddenly found that when they were facing up to the fact that death was close, were really questioning whether their faith was valid. You know, I can particularly remember one person who, you know, had been involved in church all their life, and suddenly, you know, probably a week or so before they were likely to die, they were sort of saying, well, is this that I believe really true? Do I really believe what I've said I've believed all this time or not? So, and for some, I mean, not most it wasn't the case, but for some there was that deeper questioning that suddenly, oh, I've been doing this all my life, whether it was going to church, whether they were Muslim or whatever it was. What do I now believe? Because actually, at this precise moment in time, this is the realest thing that there is for me. And I think, and then again, further from that, I think I had far more conversations that were real in the period that I was working in the hospice than we do in most of our churches.
Yeah.
Because actually, you have to be real. You can't say, oh, lovely day, isn't it? the weather's fine today or what, but actually it is a life and death situation that you're in. Those conversations are far more real, and I quite often wish that I could transfer some of that conversation that we had in hospice into our churches, because quite often we are living in cuckoo land a little bit. We're pretending and we're not being real with one another. And again, I think in part, one of the things that the current crisis we're going through is actually making us talk more to people and be more real with people than perhaps we have been as society.
Yeah, I suppose it really brings a kind of focus to things when some sort of crisis or something critical happens, has people questioning things. So, I mean, ideally, really, we want to be having these conversations, presumably, before you get to the end, because, of course, I mean, you talk about the hospice situation, some of those people may be terminally ill or may have had some time to prepare, however difficult that might be. For some people, some things can happen very instantaneously. Someone can have a sudden heart attack, or someone is knocked down by a car and is killed instantly. And, that's a sudden shock for somebody. That's a sort of different sort of bereavement in that it's instantaneous and was completely unexpected. So do you think it's important that we sort of try and have these conversations in a time when we're well, because you never really know when something's actually going to happen?
I think it definitely is, and that's one of the reasons behind Dying Matters Week, the whole organisation of Dying Matters, which was set up now in 2008, 2009, and that there's a whole encouragement there to encourage people to talk about death and dying and all the issues related to that. And one of the things that I've been involved with, and we started off when I was at the hospice, but I've also done it in some of the churches that I've served since then as well, is to try and encourage those conversations. We've run a thing called Grave Talk, which is a Church of England resource, where we arrange some meetings in a local cafe or something like that, invited people to come along. And basically, there's a series of questions that you can use, like a set of cards with different questions on, and they are designed to sort of, they do two things. They're positives and teasing out negatives a little bit. But so there are questions that are about, who's been the most influential person in your life, which makes you think about your life and what's gone on in your life. But then equally, the other end of the spectrum, there are questions. I remember the first one, the time that we did this session, one of the things that came up was something to do with finance, and I can't remember what it was. But as a result of what came up, there was a lady present in one of the small groups that we had who suddenly said, "Oh, I need to go back home and talk to my husband because he writes all the checks. He deals with all the money. I don't know how to write a check. I don't know where our bank accounts are." And it's a simple thing, but actually, if her partner had just dropped down dead, she would be completely all at sea and not able to know what to do about things. And there are other simple things like trying to encourage people to write their own will or get their will made. I mean, I was talking to a member of one of our congregations the other day who's in his late 70s, and he hasn't made his will yet. And obviously, again, the coronavirus epidemic has made him think, we've suggested that you need to get that done. We're not expecting you, and we don't want you to die anytime soon.
No.
But it's a good idea to do it and get things ready.
No, I mean, absolutely, because I mean, I told you, I work for a law firm. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I do some work with the private client team, and I know the issues that can be created when people do die intestate suddenly, especially if it's a particularly complicated estate. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit more straightforward if you just have a spouse who each leaves to each other, but actually the reality today is there's more blended families. There's more stepchildren or step families or different, extended families for different reasons, or second marriages, and all these things can throw up complications if you haven't amended your will as your life has changed. So it's very important, I think, that people make those changes when you undergo those life changes, rather than waiting until the crisis occurs. I think it probably resolves a lot of potential issues and reduces stress, presumably, because it's a very stressful time when somebody is very ill or passes away. So it's sort of good to, I suppose, be able to clear some of those things before it comes to that.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, the other thing that I seem to be encouraging people to do a little bit at the moment is to actually jot down some of the information about what's happened in their life, so that it's there and available for somebody to have. Because in some case, you know, sometimes I'm sure we've all been present at funerals where you've sort of, the person that is being remembered, the story about their life doesn't really come over. And you know, we tend to find out more about people at their death than we did during their life. And one of the things that I want to try and encourage more is actually talking to people about what's happened in their life.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember doing the funeral of a chap that a lot of the people there didn't find out till the end that he'd actually was in the SAS during the war and had flown on trips into Italy and things like that, and been working with the SAS and things like that. And there are all sorts of stories that come out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people live very long lives, you know, for the most part, people do live very long lives now, and you can undergo lots of changes in your lifetime, and you may meet different people along the way, but they may not have been with you from the beginning to kind of see that start to end. And yeah, and it's true, definitely. I think you sometimes read, you know, obituaries in a newspaper and you think, oh, I never knew that person did that in their younger days and things. And that must be true for families as well, that, you know, sometimes they discover things about their relatives that they just didn't know about. I think that's a great idea. I think a lot of people would perhaps find it difficult to broach the subject with their family. I was reading in one of the newspapers this week, and someone had written into one of those sorts of question and answer sort of problem page kind of, you know, I really want to talk to my elderly parents about, you know, what would they like if the worst was to happen. And I think, you know, how do you have any advice on how you might go about tackling that conversation? Because, you know, you don't want it to come across as like, oh, well, you know, you might die tomorrow, people, you know, I can see it being a delicate situation to approach with somebody. You know, you don't want to kind of almost say, well, I don't think you've got much longer, but at the same time, you know, it's better to have that conversation then rather than waiting.
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult. Where do you start? And where, as you say, it's not a question of saying, oh, we think you're going to die soon, so can you that's what you want to do. I think it is difficult, and I think part of the issue can be that actually some people won't want to talk about it, full stop. And if they're not wanting to talk about it, there's very little you can actually do to try and persuade them to do so. And I think in those situations, it's very difficult to try and tease out what might be their wishes. And I think that's one of the things that has been helpful when we've done sessions with people using the grave material, because it actually teases gently some of the things that, you know, might be of help later on. So, you know, and it could be occasionally dropping into a conversation. I've made my will last week, or something like that, and trying to encourage by sort of, you know, talking about, well, have you made a will yet? You can actually talk about what perhaps you might have done, or even saying something like, oh, I love that piece of music. You know, I love the 1812 overture. I think I'm gonna have that at my funeral or something. What would you like? You know, and trying to draw those things in. But I don't think we can escape from the fact that these conversations are difficult to have. Interestingly, on the Dying Matters website at the moment, if you have a look at that, they, because of the work they're doing, and I think because of the people that they are engaging with more and more, they actually had a question which was, how would you feel talking to someone close to you about the end of their end of life wishes? And the people that they've been interviewing, 81% of the people that they interviewed said that they would be happy to talk about it. Now, so obviously the sample that they're dealing with are people that have accessed their website already, so therefore they are beginning to have those conversations. If you went out around Enfield and asked people on the street, I suspect that percentage would be a lot lower than that.
I suppose perhaps actually we can even use coronavirus as an opportunity, as a sort of opening to that, or you know, if you see something on TV and you're not directly affected by it at this time, you know, maybe that's the time to say, oh, isn't it, you know, it's very sad that we're seeing this happen to this family. If, you know, the worst, what would you want in that circumstance, or how do you see us dealing with this? And perhaps that's another way to kind of open up those conversations.
I think that has helped because, I mean, particularly when the government announced, everybody over 70 is going to be furloughed, or out of the system for 12 weeks, which means that sort of, you have a mixture of some people who are saying, oh, actually, I'm 75, I'm not going to go out full stop, and staying in, keeping completely with the guidance. You've got other people who are saying, oh, well, I need to get out to restore my sanity. But as you say, I think that is partly opening up the conversations more, because people are recognizing that actually this is indiscriminate, it can hit anybody, and therefore we need to be a bit more prepared perhaps than we might be otherwise.
And I think it's been quite difficult, I think, perhaps keeping the balance between, people with, obviously coronavirus is a massive crisis. There's lots of people also undergoing who are already suffering from maybe cancer or other illnesses, and so and then being more isolated during this period, and almost thinking that actually, they would have wanted their final months to be different to this. I mean, perhaps that's a difficult thing for people to accept at the moment as well.
When we see that some of the treatment has had to have been postponed because of the risk of coronavirus, and it's been difficult watching people on the news where you've had a few interviews of people and they've said, well, I can't get my treatment at the moment, I can't go through this, nothing's being done for me. And it has been hard, because the sad thing is that is one person that's got cancer, and whereas if somebody's got coronavirus, the likelihood is that it's not one person that's going to be affected by that disease. It could well be several people that would die as a result of coronavirus being spread, whereas cancer isn't catching. It is present, but then you feel like you're being a bit heartless, and it's really, really difficult, because at the same time, every single person that dies is a special person. And that's one of the things that, again, I as a Christian minister believe, that every single person is important. So every single person's life and death is of importance. And we need to not, avoid that, and trying to give support to those people that are still, dying from other things than coronavirus at the moment has been a difficult situation.
Yes, no, it's a very difficult time for everybody. We're sort of drawing towards the end of our the interview part of our session this evening. I think if people want to find out more about things like about Dying Awareness Week and things like the Grave Talk that you were talking about, is there somewhere, can you point people in that direction?
Yeah, there is a website for Dying Matters. It's just literally dyingmatters.org, O-R-G, so they can go there. Again, the Grave Talk material, you can go onto the Church of England website and look up their funeral guides, and that's on there. There is other resources around the place. I mean, one of the things that I have found particularly helpful to me is books and stories by people who have gone on similar journeys. So I was particularly struck a couple of years ago. I read, I came across it partly because it was in one of the newspapers. A lady called Kate Gross died, G-R-O-S-S, and she wrote a book called Late Fragments. And the reason that struck me was that because there was an article written by her mother, which was in one of the papers, which told the story of how basically on Christmas Day 2014, she got up to see to her daughter, and her daughter died, age 36. And 15 minutes later, her two twins woke up to want to open their Christmas presents. But Kate Gross was she was actually involved in, I think it's Gordon Brown's government. She was I don't know what she was. She was an advisor to the government and set up a charity in Africa in her short life. But her book Late Fragments just goes through that journey, and it talks about what she I think is subtitled "Everything I Want to Tell You About This Wonderful or This Magnificent Life." And what struck me when there was within her telling her story of her last 18 months, 2 years of her life, it was saying that what she wanted to tell her boys, which she knew she was never going to be able to do, was the wonder of the world around us. and the wonder of the people around us. And I just thought that was just wonderful. It's really, really special.
Yeah.
So reading stories of people that have gone through, you know, in their final experiences of life is really, I find, really encouraging. There's another one, a book by Catherine Mannix called With the End in Mind that I'm reading at the moment. And again, that's telling that story. She was a doctor dealing with palliative care and things like that, and some of her experiences of people and their end-of-life experiences, and other chaplaincy team people that have written books and told stories of people's lives. It's really encouraging.
Well, I think, Mark, if there's a few that actually you'd like to recommend, including the ones you've mentioned, perhaps we'll just get the details from you afterwards and we'll post those up on the Facebook page so that if people are interested, they can read more about it.
That's fine.
But for now, thank you very much for the interview, and thanks for joining us this evening.